Welcome to the Deep Dive, the place where we take complex, interlocking social structures and, well, give you the distilled truth.
We know you're curious and you want more than just that surface-level summary. You really want the insight.
Definitely. And today, we are undertaking quite an intense exploration. We're looking at social power.
Yeah, we're moving far beyond just thinking of gender as, a personal trait or individual identity.
Right. Instead, we're examining it as a fundamental building block, a block of these massive systems of inequality and, frankly, domination.
It's foundational.
So the mission today is, let's say, ambitious. We're going to unpack the material that explores 4 primary domains of power.
That's right. Structural, disciplinary, cultural, and interpersonal power.
And we'll see precisely how they intersect, how they form this complex architecture of privilege and marginalization.
We'll look at how these systems operate globally, things like capitalism, settler colonialism.
And also how they play out in your everyday individual experience.
Yeah.
It connects the big picture to the personal.
Yeah.
Okay, let's unpack this.
So to really grasp the intensity of this structure, I think we have to start with its most serious manifestation. Violence.
Yeah, the sources we reviewed really emphasize that power in patriarchal societies is, historically anyway, secured and maintained by the violent enforcement of gender roles.
Strict gender roles and gender inequality. And the key point is this isn't incidental. It's not a side effect. It's foundational.
And this structural violence, it shows up everywhere, right, at every level.
Structurally, culturally, interpersonally. You see it across the board.
So let's look at a key term the sources use here. Intimate partner violence, or IPV.
Right, IPV. It's the more inclusive, sort of expansive term that's replaced older ones like wife battering or even domestic violence.
And that shift was needed, wasn't it, to acknowledge the scope?
Absolutely. It was necessary to recognize that people of all genders and sexualities can experience this kind of coercive control and violence in relationships. It's not just women in heterosexual marriages.
But the sources also bring up a really interesting, almost critical concern about this language shift.
Yes, there's a critique there. The concern is that while the term IPV is definitely more inclusive, which is good, it might risk obscuring that crucial connection between violence and specifically gender power dynamics.
How so?
Well, when you move to a completely gender-neutral definition, you risk losing sight of the historical reality and the present-day reality, too.
Which is?
That the vast majority of severe patterned abuse is still perpetrated by men against women, and it's directly linked to those traditional gender norms.
The ones that demand masculine control and, well, feminine submission.
Exactly. So the insight here, I think, is that while we must be inclusive, we can't let the language completely mask the systemic inequality that's really driving the issue.
That's a really crucial point. And when you zoom out, look at the scale, the problem is just immense.
It really is. The Centers for Disease Control, the CDC, they explicitly identify IPV, sexual violence, and stalking as major public health problems in the U.S.
And they don't hold back on the cause, do they?
No, they don't mince words. The CDC links these forms of violence directly to traditional gender norms, to gender inequality, and importantly, to the social acceptance of aggression as somehow a reasonable method of control.
So it's a system-wide failure we're looking at, not just, a series of individual bad acts.
Precisely. It's systemic. And to help advocates and survivors visualize this, how different forms of abuse work together.
Like emotional, financial, physical?
Yeah, it's all of those. How they work together to secure power. A tool was developed called the Wheel of Power and Control.
Ah, yes, I've seen that. It's quite powerful.
It really is. It illustrates that physical violence is often just sort of the punctuation mark at the end of a long sentence of non-physical coercion.
Right. It shows how all these tactics reinforce control and basically erode a survivor's autonomy in the relationship.
That's exactly it.
Okay, that sets the stage perfectly. We're talking about violence, yes, but violence secured by an organized system of power. Here's where it gets really interesting. We're going to look at the structural machinery, the engine, that keeps these systems running.
And for this deep dive, we'll use 2 major analytical tools that come up in the material.
Right, the Matrix of Domination and then the concepts of social location and intersectionality.
Okay, but before we jump into the matrix itself, we probably need to define what we mean by a system of power.
Good idea. What is it, fundamentally?
Well, these are socially constructed beliefs, practices, and cultural norms, and their function is to produce and normalize specific power arrangements within institutions.
Okay, like an example.
Sure, take patriarchy. It's not just an idea floating around, it's a system.
Right.
And it normalizes masculine dominance across families, religious groups, schools, the economy. It reproduces itself everywhere.
Got it. So it's the water we swim in, almost.
In many ways, yes. And the main theoretical framework that helps us map this organization is the Matrix of Domination.
Developed by sociologist Patricia Hill Collins.
That's right. And the term matrix itself is really key here.
Why Matrix? Not like the movie, I assume.
No, not quite like the movie. Think of it more like the material base, an interconnected structure that holds the entire system together, like the lattice structure in mineralogy, maybe.
Okay, so an invisible but rigid base that supports the whole crystal.
Exactly. It's the underlying structure. And Hill Collins identified 4 interconnected domains, basically 4 different kinds of power, that arrange themselves into this controlling structure.
4 domains. And to make this tangible for you listening, let's use that scenario we mentioned earlier, that devastating question people ask IPV survivors. Why don't you just leave?
Right. We can use these 4 domains to really illustrate how the matrix creates barriers, concrete barriers, that make leaving incredibly difficult, sometimes almost impossible.
Okay, let's break them down. Domain number 1.
The first is structural power. You can think of this as basically the power to rule.
The rules of the game.
Exactly. It's built on formal laws, institutional policies, the organizing principles of society, leadership hierarchies, all that formal stuff.
And historically, this was used very explicitly to control women, wasn't it?
Oh, absolutely. We're talking about laws, things like English common law, that literally granted men the right to chastise or, hit their wives.
Which sounds shocking today, but it was enshrined in law.
It was. Now, this practice was contested, and slowly outlawed Maryland banned it in 1882, for instance. But the legacy of those laws is long. They institutionalized that power imbalance.
And modern examples still function as structural barriers, even if they're less overt.
Definitely. Think about the lack of affordable, accessible childcare, or inflexible workplace policies that penalize caregivers.
Things that aren't explicitly about abuse.
Right, but they consistently disadvantage single parents, who are overwhelmingly women fleeing violence. These policies make economic independence and therefore escape significantly harder.
They're structural barriers. They trap survivors, regardless of their individual willpower.
Precisely. They limit options structurally.
Okay, so that's structural power. What's the second domain?
The second is disciplinary power. This is the power to punish and reward.
So enforcement.
Yes. It covers the methods of policing, enforcement policies, procedures, but also social sanctions like shunning someone or damaging their reputation. This power enforces the structural rules.
The data around IPV arrests here is, well, it's revealing about how this disciplinary power works, or maybe doesn't work.
It really is. The material notes that over 60% of all arrests for interpersonal violence are IPV related.
Which sounds like enforcement is happening, right?
On the surface, yes. But here's the critical failure in the disciplinary system. Only about a third of those arrests actually result in prosecution.
Only a third. So the system arrests people.
But fails to consistently follow through with punishment. The message that sends is huge.
And there's another really disturbing aspect, an unintended consequence.
Yes, the frequent arrest of victims themselves, or that police practice of arresting both parties when they're unsure who the primary aggressor was.
That's just awful. The system meant to help ends up punishing the victim.
Exactly. This kind of disciplinary mechanism actively discourages victims from calling for help again. It enforces the silence that the structural power relies on.
Wow. Okay, so structural disciplinary.
Yeah.
What's the third domain?
The third is cultural or hegemonic power. This is the power to influence, to persuade.
Hegemony. That's like dominant influence, right?
Right. The authority one dominant social group holds over others. This domain is built out of the commonly held ideas, values, religion, media, art, literature. It's the cultural air we breathe.
It's the persuasive part, the part that convinces people to accept the way things are.
Or to resist them.
Yeah.
But yes, it shapes how we think. This is where those rigid gender norms really live and get reinforced.
Like the cultural acceptance of aggression as a reasonable way to control a relationship.
Exactly. Or ideas about who's responsible for keeping a family together no matter the cost. These things are deeply embedded in our shared cultural history, our stories.
And culturally, this translates into shame for the survivor, doesn't it?
Immense shame. It makes them feel isolated or like they failed somehow. That pervasive cultural belief that you must keep the family together, or maybe that the abuse wasn't really that bad.
It creates a huge cultural barrier. Makes it hard to even admit what's happening, let alone ask for help.
And that maintains the abuser's control. It works hand in glove with the other domains.
Okay, which brings us to the fourth domain.
Finally, yes. Interpersonal power. This is the power of self-determination.
Our personal sense of agency.
Exactly. It's built from our individual knowledge, our lived experience, personal biases, and, crucially, our social location.
Social location, that combination of privilege and marginalization we hold based on our identity.
Precisely. And the abuse techniques used in IPV, things like gaslighting, extreme isolation, threats, economic control, they're specifically designed to attack this interpersonal power.
They chip away at the survivor's self-efficacy, their connectedness.
Systematically, they erode the survivor's personal power, their sense of self. The abuse works because, over time, the victim's sense of self-determination is diminished.
To the point where they genuinely believe leaving is impossible or too dangerous.
Yes. And the Matrix shows us how this happens. The structural failure, lack of resources, the disciplinary failure, police inaction or wrong action, and the cultural shame, those norms of silence.
They all combine.
They all combine to directly sabotage the survivor's interpersonal power. That's how the domains interlock and reinforce each other. It's a system.
That makes so much sense. It really maps it out. And it brings us perfectly from that large system right down to the individual experience.
Which is where we need to go next. How do our individual traits interact with these massive systems? How do they determine where we sit within that matrix?
Okay, let's start with social identity. How do the sources define that?
It's basically the combination of your social characteristics, things like sex, gender, race, ability, plus the roles you play, like parent, student, employee.
The groups you identify with.
And the groups you identify with, yes. It's kind of the sum total of who we think we are in relation to other people and social systems.
And it's important to make a distinction here, right, between identities that are sort of neutral and identities that are consequential.
Absolutely essential. You know, being a lover of country music, like the example in the sources, that's pretty neutral in terms of power.
Right. Doesn't really affect your access to resources.
Exactly. But your race, your gender, your sexual orientation, your ability status, these are often highly consequential. They frequently determine your access to power, safety, resources.
And we see this in the data. The sources cite that 68% of LGBTQIA+ people report feeling unsafe at school because of their identity.
That identity is directly determining their level of safety and belonging within that specific social system. It's not neutral at all.
Which leads us directly to privilege.
Yes. Privilege is defined as an unearned advantage. It's conferred by society, not earned by the individual, and it's exclusive to a particular social group.
Unearned. That's the key word. You don't get it through hard work or merit.
No. It's simply given based on your social identity, fitting the dominant norm, being white, being male, being cisgender, heterosexual, able-bodied, etc., in many contexts.
This is where we really need to challenge that persistent American ideal of meritocracy.
Oh, definitely. Meritocracy is that hypothetical system we hear about all the time, where your social status is determined solely by your personal effort and merit.
Sounds good in theory.
It sounds fair, right? But the source material is very clear. Meritocracy is an ideal, maybe a myth, but it is not our current reality.
Why not? What's the core flaw?
The starting line isn't even. It's fundamentally flawed because of privilege. When certain groups inherit wealth or access to elite education or generational health advantages or even just cultural authority based on their race or gender.
All those unearned advantages we just talked about.
Exactly, all privileges. Then the status they achieve isn't based purely on merit. It's based significantly on a structured head start.
So if meritocracy were real, privilege wouldn't exist.
Pretty much. The existence of privilege demonstrates the absence of pure meritocracy.
Okay, and if you're not benefiting from that unearned advantage, you're likely experiencing the flip side.
Which is marginalization. This is that process of social exclusion.
Where individuals or groups get pushed to the outside of economic, political, social life.
Often by being systematically denied access to resources and power, they're kept on the margins.
And the feeling of belonging or not belonging is a really key marker here, isn't it?
It really is. People who benefit from privilege generally feel, often unconsciously, that they belong, that the system, the environment, was built for them, or at least with them in mind.
While marginalized people often feel the opposite.
Yes, they often feel, quite acutely, that the environment was not created for them, that they're an afterthought or actively excluded.
And that feeling isn't just a feeling, it translates into real-world decisions and outcomes.
Absolutely. Like that data point again. 78% of LGBTQIA+ students report actively avoiding school functions because they feel unsafe or uncomfortable. That's the feeling of being designed out of the system, manifesting as behavior.
Okay, this complexity, where multiple identities interact,
Yeah.
that brings us to intersectionality.
Exactly, a hugely important concept. The term was coined by legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw back in 1989.
And she developed it to describe how multiple social locations, race, class, gender, sexuality, ability, don't just exist separately.
Right. They overlap, they intersect, they influence each other, and this creates complex hierarchies of power and oppression.
Resulting in unique inequities, not just additive, but unique.
That unique part is critical.
Yeah.
Crenshaw developed this framework because the existing legal and sociological studies at the time were failing. They were failing to see the specific challenges faced by Black women.
How so?
Well, traditionally, studies on race tended to center on the experiences of men of color, and studies on gender tended to center on white women.
So Black women's experiences fell through the cracks.
Completely. By isolating these identity factors, looking only at race or gender, they were making the unique cumulative experiences of Black women basically invisible in both fields.
Intersectionality forces us to see that these factors don't just add up, like gender plus race.
No, Crenshaw argued they multiply. Gender times race times class, creating compounded, unique forms of marginalization, or sometimes privilege.
And when you apply that intersectional lens, the impact on real-world outcomes, opportunity, wealth, health, is just staggering.
It really is. The sources specifically highlight the heightened vulnerability of Black transgender people.
Right. They're intersecting marginalized identities, being Black, being trans, create this cumulative impact.
Leading to disproportionate rates of sexual violence, poverty, homelessness, and also unique barriers when they try to seek help from systems like law enforcement or healthcare, which often aren't equipped to understand or address their specific needs.
It shows you really can't address one form of oppression in isolation. You have to see how they connect and reinforce each other.
That's the power of the intersectional framework.
Okay, so now let's drill down even further. Let's look at specific interpersonal dynamics, how this plays out in daily life, reinforced by that larger matrix of domination.
Sounds good. We can look at 3 specific phenomena the sources highlight: tokenism, microaggressions, and internalized oppression.
Let's start with tokenism. This often gets framed as a positive thing, like progress, right?
It does, but it's often actually a superficial or symbolic effort. An organization might recruit a small number of people from underrepresented groups to look diverse.
Creating the appearance of equality.
Exactly, without ever actually addressing the embedded oppressive systems, the structures, the culture, the disciplinary mechanisms that maintain inequality. It's window dressing.
And this has real costs for the individuals who are tokenized.
Huge costs. Rosebeth Cantor did a foundational research on this back when women first started entering male-dominated leadership roles in larger numbers.
What did she find?
She found that people recruited as tokens experience several negative impacts. First, extreme visibility. Their successes might be noted, but their failures are magnified and often seen as proof that their entire group is unqualified.
Wow, that's intense pressure.
Immense performance pressure. They also face amplified attention to their difference, their gender, their race, and they feel intense pressure to conform to stereotypes.
Cantor called that self-distortion, right?
Yes. Basically, the token person is expected to somehow represent their entire marginalized group while simultaneously blending seamlessly into the dominant culture. It's an impossible bind.
And just exhausting, I imagine.
Absolutely. It's mentally and emotionally exhausting. This emotional labor, which is totally outside their actual job description, robs them of energy they need for their work.
They might end up playing a role.
Often, yes. They might hyperfeminize or conversely try to act more masculine than the dominant men just to cope with the contradictory expectations.
The material offers a really interesting number here related to tokenism. The 15% rule.
Yes, Cantor's finding. She theorized that those extreme pressures of tokenism are significantly reduced once a previously excluded group represents more than about 15% of the workforce, or the group.
A critical mass.
Exactly. It suggests you need a certain threshold before the pressure shifts from the individual token onto the system itself to adapt. It becomes less about the individual and more about the group dynamic.
And this finding has actually influenced policy, hasn't it?
Yes, it's often cited as part of the rationale for some diversity initiatives or affirmative action policies. The idea being that reaching that critical mass changes the dynamics fundamentally.
Okay, that's tokenism. What's the second interpersonal dynamic?
A second is microaggressions. These are those brief, everyday exchanges.
The small slights.
Exactly. The small slights, the subtle comments or actions that send damaging messages to someone because of their group membership.
And the term itself has a history. It wasn't originally about gender or sexuality.
No, it was coined back in 1970 by Harvard psychiatrist Chester M. Pierce. He used it specifically to describe the subtle, often unconscious racial insults directed by white people toward black people.
But now we use it more broadly.
Yes, today the term is used more expansively to include that kind of casual, often unintentional harassment or insult directed at any socially marginalized group.
Psychologist Gerald Wing Su's definition really highlights their tricky nature, doesn't it?
It does. He defines them as brief, everyday exchanges that send denigrating messages. And the key is, the person doing the microaggression might see it as innocent, maybe even a compliment.
But the impact on the recipient is harmful because of their group membership.
Precisely. It's often described as death by 1,000 cuts. Each one might seem small, but the cumulative effect is significant.
And it's not a minor issue? The scale isn't small.
No, not at all. For example, one study found 80% of transgender women surveyed reported experiencing microaggressions. We can't just dismiss them as simple misunderstandings or people being too sensitive.
To help us understand them better, the sources break them down into categories, right?
Yes, and the variety is quite striking. It helps to see the different forms they take.
Like what? Give us some examples.
Okay, so you have things like alien in one's own land. This is when you assume someone who looks different from the dominant culture must be foreign.
Like asking an Asian American, where are you really from?
Exactly. Or telling someone, wow, your English is so good, implying you expected it wouldn't be.
Okay, what else?
Then there's ascription of intelligence. That's assigning intelligence or competence based on race or gender stereotypes.
Like complimenting a black person for being articulate, as if that's surprising.
Yes, the implied baseline expectation is low, which is insulting. Or assuming a woman isn't technically skilled.
Got it. Another one.
Color blindness. These are statements that claim to not see race or that deny the need to acknowledge race.
Like saying, I don't see color, or we're all just human.
Right. Or maybe, you and I have a lot in common. You're not like other Latin people. While perhaps intended to connect, these statements actually deny the person's lived reality and history of experiencing racism. It suggests their identity has to be erased to be acceptable.
That's a really insidious one. And misgendering.
Misgendering is the refusal to use a person's stated name or pronouns. It's a direct denial and erasure of their identity and autonomy. It's not just a mistake if it's persistent or intentional.
Okay. So the cumulative effect of all these microaggressions.
It's profound. They impact mental health, cause stress and exhaustion, and create toxic work or learning environments.
And if they're just ignored or brushed off?
If they're left unchecked, they normalize these low-level offenses. And that can create an environment where more severe discrimination or harassment seems more acceptable. It lowers the bar.
Okay. Tokenism, microaggressions.
What's the third dynamic?
The third is internalized oppression. This is a really complex one.
How does that work?
This is when individuals who belong to an oppressed group start to incorporate and accept the prejudices and dominant negative narratives about their own group that come from the wider society.
Wow, so they start to believe the negative stereotypes about themselves.
In a way, yes. The poet Audre Lorde had such a powerful phrase for this. She called it that piece of the oppressor which is planted deep within us. That piece of the oppressor. It's like a form of self-censoring or self-limitation.
It really is. Within a heteropatriarchal system, for example, this might look like masculine people internalizing a sense of superiority, believing their dominance is just natural or earned, which is reinforced by all four domains of power.
And for feminine people.
Conversely, feminine people might internalize inferiority, accepting masculine dominance as the natural order, or feeling shame about asserting themselves. This self-hatred or self-minimization becomes another barrier to liberation.
And this operates intersectionally too, right? That's crucial.
Absolutely crucial. Take the example of a white, cisgender, queer woman. She might do the work to address her internalized homophobia, the sense of inferiority based on her sexuality. But she must also consciously confront her internalized racial superiority from being white, or her internalized cisgender superiority from being cisgender.
Because if she doesn't address those internalized privileges.
Exactly. If she doesn't, she risks replicating harm. She might unintentionally marginalize transgender people or people of the global majority, even while fighting her own oppression. It requires constant self-reflection across all identity axes.
You used the term people of the global majority, PGM. Can you just clarify that for listeners?
Sure. PGM, people of the global majority, is a term being used more and more to replace older, often problematic terms like minority.
Why the shift?
Because minority inherently frames non-white people in relation to whiteness and suggests numerical inferiority. PGM highlights the reality that people who are non-white actually constitute the vast majority of the world's population. It centers their global presence rather than marginalizing them through language.
That makes sense. It shifts the frame.
Yeah.
Okay, that distinction is incredibly important. Now let's shift our focus upwards again. We need to connect these individual and interpersonal experiences back to the really big macro systems that organize global power.
Right. Specifically, the interlocking systems of capitalism, patriarchy, and heteropatriarchy.
Let's define those quickly. Capitalism.
So capitalism is defined as a competitive economic system. Limited resources are privately owned, and the main goal, the reward, is accumulating surplus, basically. Profit.
And the critical element, the source, is stress.
Is that inherent competition? For someone to win, someone else often has to lose. This inherently produces a class-based, unequal system.
Okay. And patriarchy. We've touched on this.
Yes, the gender-based system where masculinity signifies more power and status, and women and feminine people are collectively and systematically excluded from full participation in political and economic life.
So when these two systems, capitalism and patriarchy, merge, we get
heteropatriarchy.
Define that intersection.
Heteropatriarchy is basically a systemic merging of heterosexual norms and patriarchal structures. It's the system where cisgender and heterosexual men are granted authority over everyone else, women, LGBTQIA+ people.
Why is that combined term, heteropatriarchy, so important?
It's vital because it explicitly links discrimination against women and discrimination against LGBTQIA+ people to the exact same underlying sexist social principle.
Which is?
The enforcement of the cisgender, heterosexual male as the dominant norm, the default human. It shows these struggles aren't separate. They stem from the same root system.
And feminist scholarship connects these, showing how heteropatriarchy and capitalism work together globally.
Yes, demonstrating how they produce intersectional wealth inequality. The most obvious example is the persistent gender wage gap.
Which is even wider for women of color and trans people.
Exactly. The key takeaway is that cisgender heterosexual men are the primary institutional beneficiaries of this complex global system, often at the expense of everyone else.
This systemic dominance, it helps explain the really alarming rise we're seeing in global anti-LGBTQIA+ sentiment, doesn't it?
It provides crucial context, yes. The numbers just in the U.S. are stark markers of this backlash. Over 500 anti-LGBTQIA+ bills introduced in state legislatures in 2023 alone.
And 85 of those actually passed into law in 23 states. That's significant.
It's a coordinated effort. And this isn't just a domestic U.S. issue, it's a global trend, often driven by reactionary forces.
The sources mentioned Dr. Sylvia Tamale, a Ugandan scholar.
Yes, a highly regarded scholar. She's been very critical of the increase in homophobic rhetoric and punitive policies targeting LGBTQIA+ people in several African nations.
And she points a finger at external influences.
She specifically identifies American evangelicalism as a powerful external driver, funding and promoting these anti-LGBTQIA+ narratives and policies in some African contexts.
Okay, but here's where Dr. Tamale offers a really surprising, almost counterintuitive argument based on the source material.
Yes, it's fascinating. She directly challenges the narrative, which you sometimes hear in the West, that global tolerance for queer sexualities is solely a product of Western colonialism or some kind of recent liberal imposition.
Wait, so she's arguing the opposite, that tolerance isn't just a Western import.
Precisely. She meticulously documents what she calls a robust pre-colonial handprint of homosexuality across African history. Meaning evidence of traditional social tolerance, even acceptance, for same-sex relationships and marriages in various indigenous cultures before colonization.
So the current intolerance might be the import.
That's her argument. that the current wave of homophobia is often a political project, sometimes imposed or funded by external, often Western conservative religious groups, rather than being rooted in indigenous tradition. It flips the script.
That historical context is absolutely crucial. And we see similar reactionary forces linking identity politics and extremism back in the U.S., right?
Definitely. The recent, very visible backlash against gender expansiveness, things like the protests targeting drag queens' story hour events.
GLAD documented 161 incidents targeting those events alone in just over a year.
Right. Those protests are often tied directly to ideologies driven by what's called aggrieved masculinity and the politics of white nationalism.
Okay, unpack aggrieved masculinity for us.
It refers to that political feeling of resentment of cultural and social threat felt by some men, particularly white men, who perceive their traditional dominant status as being challenged or eroded by feminism, racial equity movements, or LGBTQIA+ rights.
A sense of losing ground.
A sense of losing ground, which is then mobilized politically. And when that combines with white nationalism, the belief that white people are inherently superior and entitled to dominate society.
You get powerful extremist ideologies fueling this backlash.
Exactly. It's the disciplinary power of the aggrieved asserting itself through cultural intimidation and, increasingly, policy.
This brings us squarely to the structure of white supremacy. And it's crucial to understand this as more than just individual prejudice.
Well, far more. It's a complex, pervasive system of racist power. It was historically constructed through laws and policies that privilege white people based on those racist, long-discredited, pseudoscientific ideas from the Enlightenment about racial hierarchy.
The idea that white people are inherently superior and entitled to dominate.
Yes. And to really grasp how pervasive it is, the material uses the concept of the white supremacy iceberg.
Okay, the iceberg metaphor. What's visible and what's hidden?
So the visible tip of the iceberg is the overt stuff. Hate crimes, racial slurs, organizations like the KKK, things most people would agree are racist.
But if you only define white supremacy by those overt acts,
you miss the massive hidden bulk of the iceberg below the waterline, the covert operations.
So what's hiding beneath the surface? What's in that deep structure?
Below the waterline are the everyday, often normalized violences embedded in the structural, cultural, and disciplinary domains.
Give examples.
Okay. Think about the structural violence of discriminatory housing policies or unequal school funding, or the disciplinary violence of mass incarceration and racial profiling by police, or the cultural violence of a school curriculum that centers European history and perspectives while ignoring or distorting others.
So restricting the definition of white supremacy only to the KKK and swastikas
risks normalizing these hidden structural violences. It lets the everyday mechanisms that maintain the racial hierarchy continue unchallenged. It keeps the whole matrix running smoothly.
And this connects directly to settler colonialism.
Yes, another key macro system. Settler colonialism is a specific type of colonialism. It's an unequal system that relies heavily on white supremacy to justify its core logic, which is the removal, displacement, or elimination of the established indigenous residents, so that settlers can permanently occupy the land and exploit its resources for their own benefit. It's fundamentally about replacement and resource extraction, not just temporary rule.
And the sources bring in the work of philosopher Maria Lugones here. How does she connect gender to colonialism?
Lugones theorized that the imposition of a strict binary gender system, male-female, dominant-submissive, was actually weaponized by colonizers. It was used as a central tool of colonialism. By imposing this rigid, narrow European definition of a proper person, colonizers could categorize and marginalize indigenous people whose cultures often embraced much more complex, fluid understandings of gender and sexuality. These were seen as uncivilized or deviant.
So the colonial project wasn't just about stealing land.
No, it was also about destroying complex indigenous ways of relating, their social structures, their spiritualities, and imposing a narrow European social and gender order in its place.
Wow, okay, this really helps explain the complexity of the term decolonization. It's not just one thing.
Not at all. It started historically, meaning the political transfer of power, like India gaining independence from the British Empire in 1947. That's formal decolonization.
But it's evolved to mean much more, personally and culturally.
Yes. For those who have benefited from colonization, those in settler societies, decolonization means a process of personal and structural divestment from colonial power.
What does that look like in practice?
It means moving beyond just feeling guilty to taking concrete action, challenging and letting go of internalized superiority, recognizing the ongoing harms, advocating for reparations or compensation for descendants of colonized peoples, and supporting movements like Land Back.
Like that example in the sources, the North Coast Land Conservancy returning land to the Clatsop-Nehalem people in Oregon.
Exactly. Concrete acts of rematriation and returning stewardship.
And crucially, decolonization is also a cultural process.
Yes, a process of challenging colonial narratives and power structures to reclaim and revitalize pre-colonial ways of being, knowing, and relating.
Including reclaiming those traditional expansive genders and sexualities that resisted the imposed colonial binary.
Absolutely. This is where we see incredible resilience and resistance in communities around the world.
The sources give some powerful examples, like the Muxes.
Yes, the Muxes among the Zapotec people in Oaxaca, Mexico. They are a recognized third gender, often assigned male at birth, but adopting feminine roles in dress. They play vital roles in preserving traditional Zapotec culture, dress, language, ceremonies.
They embody a living form of decolonization.
A vibrant vision of it, yes.
Yeah.
Rooted in a pre-colonial Zapotec understanding that seems to have been more matriarchal and accepting of gender fluidity, sometimes seen as sacred.
And the Hijras in South Asia.
Another ancient example, the Hijra community, often considered a third gender in Hindu culture, is referenced in texts going back to the 4th century BC. They traditionally hold important spiritual and social roles, like blessing marriages and births.
But they face persecution under colonialism.
Severe persecution under the British Empire, which imposed anti-sodomy laws and criminalized non-binary identities. Despite this history, their activism has been crucial.
Leading to legal recognition.
Yes, their sustained activism led India's Supreme Court in 2014 to create a legal designation for the third gender, a major victory against those colonial-era restrictions.
Amazing resilience.
Yeah.
And in indigenous North America.
We see the rise of the term two-spirit. This often uses the Anishinaabe term, Neji Metaduag, meaning of two spirits.
This is an old term.
It's actually a contemporary term, adopted in the 1990s, but it's used as an umbrella to reclaim and revitalize traditional third-gender roles and identities that existed in many indigenous nations pre-conquest.
Roles that were suppressed or destroyed by colonization, as Lucones observed.
Exactly. It highlights the spiritual implications of gender in many indigenous worldviews and the critical importance of language preservation in recovering those pre-colonial ways of being.
These examples powerfully show that expansive understandings of gender aren't new, they're ancient, and reclaiming them is a form of resistance.
They prove that the rigid binary is the historical anomaly, the imposition, not the other way around.
Okay, so we have mapped this entire architecture of power from global systems like settler colonialism right down to the intimate violence of IPV and the subtle sting of microaggressions. The huge final question is, how do we shift this? How does change happen?
Right. Because the material is very clear. These systems of power, this matrix, will continue to operate, continue to reproduce inequality until they are actively challenged and dismantled by collective action.
Change can happen, though. What drives it?
Social change can be driven by several factors. New technologies shifting how we live, major population shifts like migration, environmental crises forcing adaptation, or significant institutional changes.
The sources give that fascinating historical case study, gender roles during World War II.
Yeah, it's a great example of the complexity. During the war, women's participation in the paid U.S. workforce jumped by 50%. Rosie the Riveter became an icon.
It shattered old taboos about middle-class women working outside the home. Looks like progress, right?
It looked like massive, rapid change. But the critical point is that the change was largely temporary.
Why? What happened after the war?
After the war, the underlying structure of masculine dominance proved incredibly resilient. Women were laid off from those industrial jobs en masse.
And the culture shifted back.
Aggressively. Cultural narratives heavily promoted the ideal of women returning to the domestic sphere, focusing on marriage and motherhood. The feminine mystique took hold.
So the gender roles changed temporarily to meet the war emergency.
But the unequal system itself, the heteropatriarchy, remained fundamentally intact. It demonstrates that even huge structural shifts need purposeful, collective will behind them to achieve lasting change in power dynamics. Systems resist change.
Which means profound change usually requires something more organized. It requires social movements.
Exactly. Social movements are defined as purposeful, organized groups of people working together toward a common social goal, either to enact change, resist change, or provide a political voice to those excluded.
And sociologists have identified distinct stages these movements often go through.
Yes, Bloomer and Tilley outlined 4 common stages. First is emergence. This is where people become aware of a problem, start getting discontented, and initial leaders might emerge. It's often diffuse.
Then what?
Then comes coalescence. This is where people start to join together, organize more formally, and really begin to publicize the issue. Think protests, campaigns, building momentum, mobilizing resources.
Stage 3.
Institutionalization. This is often critical for long-term impact. The movement becomes more established, maybe forming nonprofits, hiring paid staff. It becomes more bureaucratic, more organized, no longer relying solely on grassroots energy.
It becomes part of the system it's trying to change, in a way.
In a way, yes. It gains legitimacy, but might lose some radical edge. And finally, stage 4 is decline.
Decline. That sounds negative.
It can be, but not always. Decline can happen because the movement successfully achieved its goals and decided to disband. Or it could decline because enthusiasm waned, there was internal conflict, or powerful opposition crushed it.
Speaking of opposition, we have to remember the counterforce.
Absolutely. Reactionary social movements. These movements exist specifically to block social change that progressive movements are pushing for, or to reverse changes that have already happened.
Their goal is to maintain the existing power structure, the status quo of dominance.
Precisely. The sources identify the anti-abortion movement, which seeks to overturn reproductive rights, or the current anti-trans backlash, as clear examples of reactionary movements trying to maintain or restore heteropatriarchal control.
This brings us back to that fundamental principle about how change happens, powerfully stated by Audre Lorde. The master's tools will never dismantle the master's house.
It's such a critical insight. It speaks directly to the failure of reforms that don't challenge the underlying premises of power, the foundations of the house itself.
We saw this failure right at the founding of the United States, didn't we?
Clearly. The white male founders set out, they said, to create a more perfect union, to escape tyranny. But by deliberately excluding African Americans, Indigenous Americans, and all women from citizenship and power.
They used the very same tools of exclusion and hierarchy they claimed to be opposing.
Exactly. They reproduced the very systems of power they were supposedly escaping: heteropatriarchy, white supremacy, settler colonialism. The master's house wasn't dismantled. It was just renovated to fit the needs of a slightly different group of white male elites.
So if the master's tools won't work, what will? What does successful change require, according to the sources?
It requires centering the collective agency, the leadership, and the lived expertise of the people who are most impacted by the oppression you're trying to dismantle.
Their knowledge is key.
Their knowledge is paramount. Alden Morris's research on the civil rights movement is crucial here. He emphasized that the mobilization of the Black community's internal resources, churches, networks, historical knowledge of resistance were the critical drivers of success.
Not just external allies.
Not primarily. And we see the same in the 21st century movement for Black lives. The intimate knowledge of how the system works, because you live its consequences, makes you the most skilled leader of resistance against it.
And that's the core idea behind coalitional politics today, isn't it?
Yes. Modern movements, like the prison abolition movement, for instance, are often led by coalitions where women and queer people of the global majority are central because their communities bear the brunt of state violence and mass incarceration.
Their knowledge of how the structural, disciplinary, cultural, and interpersonal domains of the Matrix intersect to create that harm is unparalleled.
Because they live it. They experience the intersections daily.
So what is the role, then, for people who are empowered by these systems? People who hold privilege, white people, cisgender people, men, heterosexual people, etc.
The role is not to swoop in and lead thinking you have the answers. The sources suggest the role is distinct and maybe less comfortable.
Which involves?
It involves getting comfortable with discomfort, really interrogating your own motivations for wanting change, and crucially, using your privilege, your access, your resources to shift power in favor of marginalized people.
Well,
by consistently honoring their knowledge, amplifying their voices, taking their lead, and being accountable to them. It's about solidarity, not saviorship.
okay. We've covered a massive amount of ground, so let's try to synthesize. What does this all mean?
I think we can boil down the foundational formula for power that emerges from this deep dive. It looks something like this. Policies that create inequity.
the structural domain.
Plus the ideas and cultural norms that justify that inequity.
Cultural and hegemonic power.
Equals the entrenched systemic inequality we see all around us. It's a feedback loop.
And we've seen how violence, whether it's overt, like IPV, or subtle, like microaggressions, works across all four domains.
Yes, violence in its many forms enforces the binaries, maintains the hierarchies, punishes dissent across the structural, disciplinary, cultural, and interpersonal domains.
But the ultimate insight, the hopeful insight perhaps, from the Matrix of Domination,
is that because these systems of power are constructed by human societies through policies, ideas, actions, they are not inevitable. They can be deconstructed.
and, crucially, reconstructed.
Exactly. Power is constructed, and therefore it can be reconstructed towards justice and equity.
That is the ultimate takeaway. And we'll leave you, our listeners, with a final provocative thought to mull over, building on Audre Lorde again.
She said, "The future of our Earth may depend upon the ability of all women to identify and develop new definitions of power and new patterns of relating across difference."
So now that you've journeyed with us through how power is embedded structurally, culturally, disciplinarily, interpersonally, take a moment to consider your own social location today, right now.
Where can you identify just one instance of unearned advantage, one privilege in your own life?
And then ask yourself, how might acknowledging that privilege, really sitting with it, allow you to be in genuine solidarity with someone who is marginalized by that very same system?
That acknowledgement, that shift in perspective, that's the immediate personal work of beginning to reconstruct power.